Debbie and Lane and everyone, thank you so much for being here. It is a treat to be once again in this beautiful space with so many friends and some new friends as well, and to be able to talk to you on this particular day. And I did just want to pick up really where Lane left off. Before, in presentations of this program, I know I've said it to you, but I don't think it can be said often enough. A man I had the privilege of working for a lifetime ago, Ronald Reagan, famously started saying back in 1961 that every generation faces an existential threat to freedom, and it has to be fought for. It can't simply be passed on through the bloodstream to the next generation. And of course, the event that we are celebrating today, 75 years after the event, was one of those moments where it was all on the line. And that generation, that greatest, if you will, generation, measured up. Ronald Reagan, of course, went on to contend with another existential threat to freedom, had a microscopically small role in helping him do it, but in the 1980s, he secured a mandate to roll back the Soviet Union and defeat it from the American people. And one of the reasons that he did secure that mandate, I believe, was not only his own clarity about the threat, but he was helped along in articulating it and explaining it to the public by an informal pickup team of national security professionals and subject matter experts and business leaders and other patriots who came together under the banner of something they called the Committee on the Present Danger. And he joined the group himself, interestingly enough, and then once he was elected president, basically, in part at least, on the basis of their platform and their strategy, he brought about 31 of them into his administration to help him execute that strategy. The rest, as they say, is history. We have, since the last days of March, been pulling together a similar group of people, some of whom are represented here, others of whom are also represented here who were working with us, under the banner of the Committee on the Present Danger, China, to deal with, as has been mentioned, the existential threat of our time. And truthfully, I think there's no real dispute. This adversary makes the others pale by comparison. And what you're going to hear tonight from three of the most accomplished and respected practitioners of their particular areas of expertise is just how serious that challenge is from China, specifically the Communist Party of China, and what they are doing across a broad front to really endanger freedom as we know it and love it and seek to protect it. And also, by the way, as a lot of other people either have it or aspire to have it. This is a global threat. Again, proportions that make the others seem trivially small. And we're going to make that point, I think, in some degree of detail in connection with one specific threat axis, if you will. And that is what China is doing in, if I could use this term loosely, the cyber domain, the electromagnetic spectrum, if you will, and specifically with respect to the 5G, fifth generation wireless technology. So let me introduce our speakers. And we're going to do a little bit of speaking, and then a little bit of conversing, and then a lot of Q&A with you. Each of these men have a couple of things in common. In addition to being people I cherish, I'm very proud to call friends. They're all brilliant, and you'll see that. They're all visionary And they're all exceedingly skilled in the various, as I say, specialties that they have. We'll start with Gordon Chang. As Debbie has said, Gordon is one of the country's foremost experts on Asia, and most especially China. He's lived there, he speaks Mandarin, he's intimately familiar with the history and the psychology, the psychopathic character of the Chinese Communist Party, and few, if anybody, in America today speaks about it more eloquently and more knowledgeably. So we'll have him set the stage for us in terms of the threat at the 30,000-foot level. To my immediate right is, of course, a homeboy, Kevin Freeman. I hope you all know him, among other things, now, because he is the star of a fabulous new television program called Economic War Room with Kevin Freeman, which you can find at Blaze TV. economicwarroom.com is how you can get access to it. He's got a producer or two here in the room with him that you'll also want to talk to. But this is the sort of culmination of decades of experience working in the financial sector, including as a chartered financial advisor for people like Sir John Templeton. He is the author of two terrific books. I didn't mention Gordon's three, but you can find them outside. Kevin's Our Secret Weapon and Game Plan. And he's going to talk a bit about specifically the unrestricted form of warfare that China has engaged in against us for decades, unbeknownst to most of us. And finally, just in the nick of time, is Andrew Whitney, who has an extraordinarily impressive background in a number of different fields. He hails from the United Kingdom, but had the good sense to come here. Has found a wonderful woman he's married and lives with in North Carolina, but along the trail, PhD from Cambridge University and Royal Air Force pilot and Bain Capital Master of the Universe, and now a tremendously impressive strategic technology investor specializing in the energy space, but having a lot of acumen in things like the cyber domain and now what's coming like a hurtling down the tracks runaway locomotive, the 5G competition with China.
Well, thank you so much, Frank. And thank you, Debbie and Lane, for putting all of this together. Just about everything is on the line in our struggle with China. And I'll try and, as Frank said, put this into context, because this is really where we determine our future for the next decade and perhaps decades to come. And as we have heard tonight, this is the struggle of our generation. You know, we talk about a trade war with China, and President Trump has imposed tariffs. Those tariffs, we should remember, are supposed to be a remedy for the theft of US intellectual property by China. Each year, China takes somewhere between $150 to $600 billion of US IP. This is a grievous wound to the US economy because increasingly, we have an economy based on innovation. And if we cannot commercialize our technical learning and all the rest of it, then we don't have an economy of the future, and we don't have a society of the future. We Americans think of this as a trade war. The Chinese, though, are thinking in much broader terms. In the middle of last month, on the 13th, People's Daily, which is the most authoritative publication in China, said that it is now in a people's war with the United States. This is broad. As Frank said, this is unrestricted warfare. We're talking about military issues as well as economic, technological, and from the Chinese perspective, perhaps the most important is an ideological contest with the United States. Now, analysts, and you've heard this so many times, analysts will tell you that really it's the US and China are struggling for dominance. This feeds into one of Beijing's narrative, that the United States is in terminal decline And really what we're trying to do is jealously preserve our role in the international system. Well, yeah, we are trying to preserve our role, but more important, we are trying to preserve the international system itself. This international system of treaties, laws, norms, conventions, rules, this is what we are trying to protect. China, unfortunately, does not accept that. Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, has in recent years been talking in terms of tianxia, or in other words, China's right to rule all under heaven. You've all heard the concept of mandate of heaven. This is what he is referring to. So, in 2017, in September, his foreign minister wrote an article in Study Times, which is the Communist Party's Central Party School newspaper, a very influential organ. And in this article, Wang Yi said that Xi Jinping thought, and in Communist Party lingo, a thought is an important ideological body of work. Wang Yi wrote that Xi Jinping thought made innovations on and transcended 300 years of Western international relations thinking. Well, if you take 2017, you subtract 300 years, you almost get to 1648. 1648 is the year of the Treaty of Westphalia, which establishes the current international system. We call our system Westphalian. It is the system that recognizes sovereign states. They sovereign states, they compete and they cooperate, but that's our framework. By the use of the word transcended, Wang Yi was saying that Xi Jinping doesn't see sovereign states, or at least no more than one of them being China. Xi Jinping not only thinks and talks tianxia, he actually acts that way. In April of last year, the Chinese lasered an Air Force C-130 cargo plane, blinded 2 of the pilots. If you blind the pilots of a plane, we have to assume that the Chinese were trying to bring down the plane. If you're trying to bring down a plane, we have to assume that they were intending to kill the crew. Last spring, Chinese used sonic attacks, and they caused brain injuries to our diplomats at the Guangzhou consulate. So we know that the Chinese believe that they have the right to do whatever they want, because that's the only justification for these acts, that we don't have sovereignty and that the Chinese are rulers of the heavens. Unfortunately, we have yet to disabuse them of that notion, because when we look at this, this is their notion of a dictatorial, one-party state determining what happens in the rest of the world. For us, we've got to then think about this people's war, because this people's war is much broader than what we Americans think. And as we go forward, we have to understand that the Chinese declared this war, they're going to wage it, and we have no choice but to respond to it. And by God, because this is the struggle that defines our generation, we must win it. Thank you.
Well, it is an honor to be on the stage with these fine gentlemen. I've had the opportunity to speak to a number of the groups, the Dallas Eagle Forum and the Park Cities, and I really appreciate every opportunity. But it is really important that we grasp the fact that we are in an economic war, and it's beyond economic, it's a culture war, but it is an economic manifestation of a broader war. In fact, I'd take it a step back. It's a spiritual war, and we're fighting it, and the Chinese are our main adversaries in this war. And it's not a new thing. It's been going on for quite some time. From the moment that China turned as a communist state, they have been against the purposes and the intentions and the freedoms that we have. So I thought I'd open with a story. I do that on the Economic War Room whenever I can, a historical story, and I think it's important because on February 21st, 1945, so we're past D-Day, February 21st, 1945, a Scottish Christian minister died in an internment camp in Weifang, China, a Chinese city in the Shandong province. If you've seen the movie Chariots of Fire, you know who I'm talking about. It was the Scottish runner, Eric Liddell, who refused to run on the Sabbath, and he was a 100-meter expert, and he refused to run on the Sabbath, but he then won a gold Olympic medal in the 1925 Olympics, or 1924 Olympics in Paris, in the 400-meter, which was not his event. What did he do? You know, they asked the athletes, what are you going to do? You just won. He said, I'm going to China, and I'm going to take the gospel of Jesus Christ to the Chinese. Now, he died in an internment camp, not because the Chinese imprisoned him, but the Japanese, who were occupying at the time, had imprisoned him. And the loss there was so significant. All of the British Empire wept and cried with his loss, and also the Chinese and also the communities. Why do I share that with you? Because I share it with you because 75 years later, there are also internment camps interning people based on their religious beliefs. And it's not just Christians. It's the Uyghurs, the Muslim population. It's multiple religious groups. Now, about 4 years ago, 5 years ago, some of you all know Alan Clark, my dear friend, the Vietnam veteran, just a tremendous man. He has a national security group that meets occasionally. I spoke there, and a man came up to me and said, you've got it all wrong about China. They're our friends, and they love Christians, and they're going to be very supportive. And I said, you're entirely wrong. And then I saw his Chinese wife, and she was married to him, and she was filming everything that we did and posting it on the internet in China. And why do I share that? I share that with you because China is running a very sophisticated information economic war against us. It's not just that they steal intellectual property, they do. And if you add $600 billion up over 20 years, and you add that up, that is an enormous amount of money. Enough to pay off a huge chunk of our federal debt. That's a lot of money. They do forced technology transfers. If you want to do business in China, sure, just show us your technology, and they steal it. And I was there firsthand at a Shenzhen company that Konka Television was the name of it. They manufactured original equipment manufacturing. I was there on behalf of the Templeton organization, and we were looking at them as an investment. And I said, why should we invest in you? You're an OEM. You just manufacture equipment that's sold by other companies like Philips and Magnavox and Sony and Panasonic. And they said, oh, because we're going to have our own brand of television. Really? How are you going to develop your own brand of television? Oh, we took the best ideas from all of these that we make, and we've created our own brand just in time for the Beijing Olympics. They flat out stole all of that technology. And unfair trade practices, and global debt traps, and manipulations of markets. All of this is published in a book titled Unrestricted Warfare. It was published in 1999 by two senior colonels that are now generals, and this is the strategy of China. And I talk about it all the time on the TV show, in my books, and everything else. But I want to tell you, when I started to share this information, and I was a Pentagon analyst back in 2008, 2009, 2010, and I would go in and I would meet with 3-star and 4-star and top people in the Pentagon, and you know what they repeatedly told me? Why in the world would China try and harm us? We owe them $1 trillion. They wouldn't ever do that because you don't want to bother with those people. And they buy all our goods. They said, no. The big lie was that China is a benign third world nation adopting freedom and growing rapidly. What I say is what we see as a marketplace, our enemies see as a battle space. And China sees this as a battle space. Their plan is they believe. Here's the other thing that you'll hear in the Pentagon. This will shock you, I hope not, but it shocks me. I heard repeatedly that China is going to eventually rule us, so we must learn to peacefully coexist, adapt, and hopefully steer in the right direction. Where did we hear that before? I heard it in the 1970s when I started college, and I was told the Soviet system is going to win, and we must learn to just gracefully decline. And you know what else I heard? And I heard it very recently. I heard this concept, oh, come on, America. You know, we stole a lot of technology from the British when we were developing our country, and so it's okay. This is just what emerging powers do. But their emerging power is a big lie. It's a totalitarian system, and it is a human rights violator to the worst degree. One thing I want to share with you to wrap up is I spoke at the Heritage Foundation, and at the Heritage Foundation, I had a lady walk up to me, and afterwards she handed me her Georgetown card, and she said, I'm a China Studies professor at Georgetown. I said, "You're PLA, aren't you?" And she said, "Why, yes, I am." I said, "Are you going to do anything about it? Somebody going to whack me?" And they said, "No." And I said, "Why not?" They said, "We own half this town." I said, "Who owns the other half?" She said, "The Saudis." Yep. So I close with that, but I'm telling you, we're in an economic war, and they are literally stealing us blind.
Kevin, thank you. PLA, in case that isn't familiar to you, is People's Liberation Army. And it's a nice segue to a company called Huawei, which is the People's Liberation Army or the Chinese Communist Party doing business as a mega conglomerate in the telecommunication space, which wants to eat our lunch in 5G. To talk about that and what we must do to counter it, I'm very pleased to have Andrew Whitney. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Frank. Good to meet you all. Privileged to be on the stage with these guys. Terrible to have to follow them, so I'll do my best. But yeah, so the topic in particular that Frank's mentioned is the whole 5G situation and Huawei, which you hear a lot about on the news at the moment. It's very topical. We're going to pull these Huawei switches out. We're going to ban them from the market, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of people, talk a lot about 5G, but without necessarily knowing what it is. So I thought what I might do is just very quickly explain what 5G really is. Because there's a tendency to think it's just sort of, one more generation than 4G. It's a sort of a gentle iteration of something that's been going on for a while. It really is a massive step change, 5th generation technology. You'll hear lots of acronyms and technical terms thrown around in certain circles. The rest of the time, what you'll hear in the mainstream media is that 5G is really about just getting movies even quicker, being able to play video games even more easily, and that your refrigerator can order its own food and that sort of stuff. And that's basically what you get told. And, where's the harm in that, right? Fine. Well, that's far from the reality of what 5G really is, or what it's capable of, more importantly. And I should say at the outset that 5G, it offers tremendous potential for improvement of people's livelihoods and opportunity and well-being and so forth. So it's a wonderful technology if it's used in the right way and if it's not controlled by the wrong people. Literally the worst thing that could happen to the world right now, in my opinion, is Chinese control of the 5G space, and I'll explain why. To understand the 5G debate, if you will, essentially all 5G revolves around discussions about spectrum, so where these transmissions occur, and who owns the spectrum bandwidth and that sort of thing. It's about data and computation power, so data and compute, and it's about cost. That's really what it all boils down to. If you take any of the other issues, they really do boil down to those three things. So that's important to bear in mind. You will hear lots of acronyms thrown around and technical terms, but really let's talk about the practical applications of 5G so you have a sense of why it is a problem if it ends up in the wrong hands. Massive amounts of data transmitted reliably with very little what's called latency, so it means there's no delay. What does that give you? That gives you the ability to do surgery at a distance. As a surgeon, I could sit here manipulating a robot which is performing open heart surgery on you on the other side of the world because there's no lag time in the feedback system because the technology is just so superior. So that's one small example. It also means you can have entire factories running themselves independently without worrying that something's going to fall off the production line and not get caught and this, that, and the other. It allows you to have immense control over systems. We'll come back to that. You'll hear a lot of talk about the Internet of Things. So the Internet of Things, it means everything becomes a sensor. Your car is full of sensors. You're wearing health sensors. You've got sensors in everything. And again, we get back to the refrigerator example. It can tell what level everything's at and order more stuff automatically. Again, sounds great, but you need an enormous amount of compute to manage all the data flowing to and from those systems in the moment, in real time. And again, we'll come back to why that's an issue. Vehicles, they call it kind of vehicle to everything. So vehicles will have sensors. They'll be picking up all the information from all those gadgets on you as you walk down the street to figure out whether you're about to leap into the path of the vehicle. It'll be picking up information from infrastructure. It'll be picking up information from the traffic grid that says, nah, steer him that way because there's too much congestion happening over there. So again, sounds great, right? Terrific. The problem with all this is all of those data streams, if you run the network on Chinese equipment, all those data streams then belong to the Chinese. And this is where the problem starts, because the Chinese would then have absolute visibility into everything. From a corporate standpoint and a commercial economic standpoint, that means they would be able to see the precise stock levels at any facility, anywhere in the country. They'd be able to see all the stock items in any truck moving anywhere. And that gives you a tremendous opportunity to manipulate pricing to destroy entire industries. I'll give you a practical example of this right now. Right now on Amazon, there are 500,000 counterfeit retailers from China. And what they do is they'll take a snapshot of your website. If you've come up with a gadget, they'll copy the gadget, create a fake website using all of your website content, and they'll put it up there for literally a penny less on Amazon. Well, of course, the pricing algorithm on Amazon then puts them top of the list, and you go on there to shop for that widget, and you just click the one at the top of the list, right? You don't go rolling through pages. So they just got a grip of that company's entire market by literally dropping a penny in price. They never developed anything, they never developed any IP, they just stole it all, basically. That's a crude example using today's technology. Now, you imagine if you can see across every logistics supply chain in an instant. You know, that's a tremendous power that can be wielded. Now imagine that you can see, and this has actually happened, the Fitbits on everybody's armed forces in a moment, and you can figure out what state of health they're in, how dehydrated they are, and you also know where their water supplies are, what their ammunition levels are, how much sleep they've had. You can start to figure out who to wallop first and in which order. And it just goes on and on and on. And I can walk you through dozens of these examples, but all those control systems and those factories that are running off this, you can shut them down in an instant. Or you can turn everything from your refrigerator to your toaster into an incendiary weapon by just basically running it, too high on its clock cycle. And so what starts off as a terrific technology in the wrong hands turns into an enormous liability. And as I said at an event we had in Washington earlier in the week, if I had a choice between control of every weapon system out there right now, all the nuclear missiles, this, that, and the other under the sun, or control of the 5G system, I would take that 7 days a week. Because before you've even launched any of that stuff at me, I've destroyed every single one of your industries. I've wiped out your forces. I've cut them off. I've sent harrowing messages to your forces' families directly to individuals in the rear that will terrify them. I will vaporize your support as a politician if you're out there going against me by sending, again, targeted messaging. And you can do all of that at the speed of light using a 5G network that you control, quite apart from the fact that you're reading all the SIGINT and everything else. So it is absolutely terrifying as a weapon. Now, we've all been led to believe that we've completely lost this battle and Huawei is the only one out there. By the way, people say to me all the time, how come Huawei is the only one out there? What about this company? What about that company? Essentially, they were all either put out of business by predatory pricing over the years, or they were acquired, or their IP was stolen and then they were put out of business. So it means that Huawei is one of the only competitors out there now. And the reason they're the only name that comes up is partially because of that. It's also partially because of the way spectrum is allocated. And because most countries do an auction and essentially the highest bidder wins and gets that spectrum, it means a lot of these networks have very little left to spend on equipment. So the Chinese know this, they put the predatory price switches out there, and of course that's what gets sucked in as the equipment base. So then you end up in a situation where economically, because of the commercial business model of networks, they're the only choice, and also technically they're the only one available in the marketplace.
So, Andrew, as we are over time now, would you say another minute?
Mm-hmm.
say what we do about it?
So, what you would need to solve this problem is you would need to have a secure supply chain solution, have it all made in America again, in a secure supply chain. You would need to have an outstanding computational solution that allowed you to deliver all of this at a very effective cost point. So to have end-to-end cyber protection across all these networks, secure supply chain, and another feature which is very important is to have something which is EMP attack resilient. So you can't have your networks knocked out by an electromagnetic pulse attack, something people always overlook, and yet it's absolutely part of the military doctrine that Kevin referred to. It's one of their opening gambits in any type of situation. It's also a somewhat unattributable attack mode. The good news is we actually have that. We just haven't told anybody about it yet, but that will be coming out relatively soon. So there is a secure supply chain solution which is all American. It is immensely impressive on the level of compute, far superior to anything anyone has ever seen before, and it uses a fraction of the energy. So the long and the short of it means the solution is there, but we just got to get moving really quickly. And you know, praise God, the president has had the determination to push through these executive orders and to take these bold steps that create a situation that allows us to recover the situation.
Thank you. Would you join me in? So we're going to take a couple of minutes and just talk amongst ourselves. You can listen in, and then you need to give us the cards so that we can talk about what you want to talk about. I wanted to ask Kevin, I think probably you begin with and the others chime in, if I can. Point that mic that way, if you would. One of the things, and we've been doing a series of these programs in Washington mostly, in New York. This one here, obviously, we're doing one in Chicago on the 22nd of June. All of them are available, if you want to check them out, at presentdangerchina.org as videos, and very, very formidable presentations have been made, including by these gentlemen. Kevin, one of the axes of the economic warfare that most of us are unaware of at all, but you've done programming on it just in the past 24 hours, you've been focused on it, we talk about it on our radio show a lot, and that is the fact that they've managed to get us to underwrite the threats that they are now mounting to us in the economic space, in the military, and so on. Talk a little bit about that, if you would.
Well, who here has not heard from an advisor or someone else they work with that China is the next great investment opportunity? And so they've captured enormous amounts of American capital. The largest initial public offering in the history of the United States was Alibaba Corporation. They raised $25 billion, mostly American, and they used that money to buy up technologies in Silicon Valley. What we got was worse than a pig in a poke. At least you get the pig. What we got are shares of a variable interest entity, VIE, which is a Cayman Islands corporation that has no transparency, no corporate governance, no vote, shareholder votes of any type into Alibaba. But we just handed them the keys to our market. Not only that, but if you own index funds, how many people own index funds? Something like 50 companies on the New York Stock Exchange and hundreds of billions of dollars and some 600 additional companies in the over-the-counter markets are Chinese companies that we don't really know if we're getting fair accounting, because you have no idea if the accounting principles are good, because you can't go in and really audit them. And there's another of our colleagues who's found a number of frauds, Enron-style frauds there. If you own global indices, like you put the MSCI World Index and you buy, I want to own an index of global stocks, a certain percentage of those automatically go to Chinese companies, and that's going to double in the next year. So the idea is that your investment dollars are being weaponized against this country by our main adversary, China. And they've learned it, they've got a system. So the money you invest in a Chinese company might be supplying the surveillance camera at the internment camp. it might be helping to fund through the bond market or the stock market, might be helping to fund aircraft carriers the Chinese are building, or the Chinese underground wall where they have a network of rail systems with intercontinental ballistic missiles aimed at the United States. Our money has been weaponized against us because the Chinese understand economic warfare. What we see as a marketplace or just another investment, our enemies see as a battle space or a weapon to be used against us. We're financing the very rope with which they might hang us.
Would you gentlemen like to take a cut at that, or no?
Just one little point about the Alibaba offering. This was a structure that under Chinese law is questionable. We know that because in the middle of last decade, China took one of those structures that foreign investors used to invest into a Chinese telecom company and expropriated the foreign interest. So it's even worse than what Kevin mentioned, as hard as that may seem.
And they're raising another $20 billion. Right now, they're planning a $20 billion IPO, a second offering.
With similar lack of transparency.
No transparency.
And this is the piece of this that is so astonishing, is that they're getting away with this in American and other Western capital markets without having to meet at all the transparency and accountability requirements that American companies, you've heard about Sarbanes-Oxley, for example, does not apply to Chinese companies. How could that be? Well, it shouldn't be, and it's one of the things the Committee on the Presentation is going to try to fix. Andrew?
Just a quick additional note on that. I mean, absolutely, as a private equity guy, if I tried to make investments on the same basis that it seems to be allowable vis-a-vis China, I mean, I'd get thrown out of the firm, sort of thing. I mean, it's just remarkable that that duality is allowed to exist. So that's got to be stopped. There's no, where are the credit rating agencies on this? Where's the transparency? It's absolutely shocking.
Material risk, specifically.
Absolutely,
That's not being disclosed.
And then there's another dimension to this, though, that's a lot more visceral for me as a technology investor. What we're talking about here is the kind of the high finance end of it all, which is like absolutely billions in portfolios being invested in infrastructure projects and ghost cities in China, and and the very missile systems that are being sold to the Iranians that are now pointed at our ships in the Straits of Hormuz. That's all being raised in the US. That's the high finance end of it. At the other end of it, sort of down in the old technology investing trenches where I am, sort of thing, there's an absolute dearth of US venture capital. There's the lot over in the Pacific Northwest that think they're the be-all and end-all of technology and that are mostly fiddling around in social media that creates no jobs and mostly makes people miserable. Back in the real world where it's all about kind of jobs and gainful employment, there's a dearth of investment capital because it's all being sucked out and sent overseas. But here's where it gets interesting. Part of that comes back around, and the only people padding up and down with their checkbooks out are the Chinese. So American entrepreneurs are left with a choice of, they spent years trying to develop something, and the only person they can get a check from is the Chinese. But whose money was it to begin with? It started in this room. And so that's really frustrating. And sometimes they'll come along and they'll try and get a piece of technology off you, and you're like, I know where you're coming from, and you're not getting that. So then they'll come back in through a Singapore company, and you're like, yeah, okay, so now you're coming in through Singapore. No, you're not getting that. Then it gets really interesting. Then at a retirement age American man, often from Texas, let's say he's called John, comes along, amiable chap who doesn't like people from Texas, right? And he comes along and says, hey, I'd like to make an investment in your company. Well, then you find out that he sold his company to the Chinese, like a couple of years ago, and basically he's now acting as a cipher for them. Now, it's really sort of, it's a deal.
But a lack of disclosure is a serious problem, and as long as there's been a number of shameless self-promotion plugs, let me just put one in for Kevin Freeman, who has another sideline to his extraordinary contributions in this space, and that is something he calls the National Security Investment Consultants Institute, which is a vehicle for training people who advise people like you about how to invest your money to help you avoid investing them in ways that hurt our country, and instead, ideally, get you a good return by doing something that helps our country. So see him after if you'd like to know more about that and how you can get your investor management advisor to sign up. There are now before me a number of extraordinarily good questions, and I'd like to go through a couple of them with you all quickly. The question has occurred, you alluded, Andrew, to an executive order by the president about Huawei. Does the U.S. government actually understand the magnitude of this problem? And a sort of related question is, if it does, how come some of our most important allies don't seem to have? And what are the implications of them not, eschewing this network that will have the kind of characteristics you've just described as being controlled by the Chicoms?
Right. So I think there's two parts there. I would say that that there are certainly important elements within the U.S. government that do understand the scale of this problem, and that's how you get a bold initiative that essentially bans a company from a marketplace when most of the folks out there don't even know there's an alternative. So I mean, you've got to be pretty bold to block something from a market when you haven't got anything else rolled out yet. So I mean, so I do think there's an appreciation there on one level, but a lot of other elements of the government will be saying, oh no, there's no threat there, and that kind of thing. So there's a mixed problem there, and it is an education process, and we've got to bring people up to speed, and we've got to make it more accessible and kind of convey the sorts of things I've conveyed this evening, because the mainstream media, either because they're all dumb or they think you guys are dumb, they're just pushing this thing. He's like, yeah, more movies, great. How many hours in the day have you got? But the other side to this is the allies. What about the allies? Why are they making ridiculous decisions?
Including Her Majesty's government.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, and I'm probably uniquely qualified to speak on that topic. It's pretty much anything that government over there does right now makes no sense whatsoever, even to me. So I think that there are a lot of there's a lot of conflicted governments. It's absolutely the case. I mean, per Kevin's point, if they own half of Washington, how much of London do you think they own? They've been peddling influence everywhere for decades, and because they've got the checkbooks out, I mean, they've absolutely weaponized our own capital markets against us, and the Russians never managed to do that. And so this is a major revolution in terms of economic warfare, per Kevin's mantra. And so that's the problem, is that they've got their tendrils in all over the place, and they are able to influence policy and push people in directions that are not favorable. And the trouble is they co-opt the networks. And I'm not going to sit here and say that all these network corporations are bad, but it's certainly the case that some of them have put their own profits above national security. And the view they take is, well, look, it's just my job to represent the shareholders. Not true.
Gordon, one of the things that is at least tangentially related to the kind of data access and management that we've been talking about in the context of 5G is now being used by the Chinese as part of a surveillance state apparatus that I kind of think of as Orwell on steroids. The question's been asked, is there dissent in China any longer? And if there is, how much longer is it going to be possible if these technologies are now being brought to bear to essentially identify and then suppress? We're celebrating D-Day today. Earlier in the week, we commemorated the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen. So in that context, talk a little bit about the prospects for, dissent, if there is any, in China, and the danger that they are now exporting this technology, along with 5G, to other nations around the world as well.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. When you look at the Chinese people, there is, I think, the most important thing is that the party has lost hearts and minds. And we've seen so many symptoms of dissent. where the party understands that it can coerce people, but it can't lead anymore. So what Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, has been trying to do is, as Frank mentioned, to utilize the instruments of coercion to make sure that there is no or very little dissent. And one of the most important things here is the social credit system, which I think most people have heard of. Right now in China, there are a number of local social credit system experiments. And some of them succeed and have popular support. Many of them do not. But what Xi Jinping is trying to do is to take these local experiments and to expand it nationwide. The goal is by 2020 to have a nationwide system. I don't think they're actually going to be able to do that by next year, but within 3 or 4 years, they probably will be able to solve the technological problems and actually put this into place. What this means is that every Chinese resident and citizen will get an updated score, and that score will be changed because of behaviors. So for instance, jaywalking will lower your score. If, for instance, you pay your taxes on time, your score will be increased. If you criticize Xi Jinping, you're in trouble. What we have seen so far with these local social credit systems is that people who have low scores are not entitled to send their children to private school. They can't board a plane. May not even be able to walk out their front door, which is what Chinese officials have been talking about. So it's an incredibly coercive program. This is in part because Xi Jinping believes that the Communist Party should have absolute control over the Chinese people. Now, pushing too hard, they have created their own adversaries, and we have seen symptoms of dissent. So Xi Jinping is not only trying to control people through the social credit system, but also through the Great Firewall, which attempts to de-link China from the global internet, and other means. And we've seen, Kevin talked about the concentration camps in what the Chinese call Xinjiang, and they're now starting to spread to Tibet, along with a number of other things. But fortunately, Frank, no government has ever been able to do this over a long period of time. With China's technological superiority, as we've seen, and as Andrew's talked about, they can make great inroads. But the Chinese people, like people in other countries, have always been able to express dissent, and at certain points in time, they have been able to overturn mighty-looking governments. And China's problem right now is, for the first time in a generation, they are facing an economic downturn. Xi Jinping has adopted all of these sort of Maoist, state-dominated policies. It's affecting the economy. The trade war, quote unquote, is also affecting the economy. And for a Chinese generation of people who have never known a downturn, this is eroding support for the Communist Party. So you put all this together, Frank, I don't know how it occurs, but clearly at some point we will see a break in the Communist Party's grip on the Chinese people. It's happened at certain periods in history. It will happen again.
Well, we can't leave on that happy note, can we? No, I hope you're right, Gordon, needless to say, and we're going to tease out some of these ideas a little bit further. We had Kevin, I think, a question that you'd be particularly suitable to discuss, as you've given a lot of thought and attention to this phenomenon of electromagnetic pulse and the degree to which our country is very susceptible to it. Andrew has been working the technology piece of it. Kevin has been joining us in warning about the policy pieces of it. Here again, the president has recently issued an executive order saying we have to protect our grid. The Chinese clearly understand that we haven't so far, among others. How vulnerable are we, and to what extent can these sorts of technologies be used as new avenues by them to penetrate and subvert the grid upon which, fundamentally, all of our lives depend?
Well, the reality is this is a nonpartisan issue. I know that some people tend to lean conservative or Republican or whatever, but the reality of it is Ted Koppel wrote a book titled Lights Out. Any adversary of the United States understands that you can end the nation if you can take the power grid down for any length of time. That's just a fact. And our adversaries understand it better than most. In fact, it was written up extensively in Unrestricted Warfare, where they said a single man-made stock market crash, an electromagnetic pulse. This is a part of the doctrine, not just of China, but Iran and North Korea and Russia. And they've known about this. Technology's been around forever. And Frank and I attended a conference that we had at Maxwell Air Force Base, Air Force University. Lieutenant General Stephen Quast convened the best engineers, the best minds. But here's the reality. You sit there and you understand this is a fact. You can take our grid down. Now, there are some Chinese efforts, and there's a great article the Center for Security Policy just posted, where there's Chinese influence efforts to convince the Edison Electric Institute and others, oh no, don't worry about this. And you see a lot of don't worry about this. This is a fact. Every engineer I met with said, yes, you can do this. Everyone that's credible in this world understands that you can take a power grid down, and if you do, it ends the nation if you take it down for a year or more. 90% plus of Americans would die. The Chinese know this, and that's a first-line attack. And guess what? They could come in, do an EMP, and then show up on the doorstep and say, but we will supply, rebuild, and so forth, and make us a slave state if they wanted to. That's the risk, and we have to protect our grid. But there's an effort in Washington to prevent us from protecting our grid. There was a report that came out while we were in Alabama at the Air Force Base that came out that is a power industry report that basically said, no, it's not a problem, it can't happen. I'm telling you, it's a reality, and it's not a reality just from the Chinese being able to do it. If we're not careful, the sun will send out an electromagnetic pulse through a coronal mass ejection that could do it. But the Chinese have infiltrated our government and attempted to tell us that this is not a problem, we should never worry about it. And I'll just give one quick story. I spoke at the Defense Intelligence Agency. The China analyst, the top of the China desk, was a man named Lonnie Henley. I don't know if you know Lonnie. He knows you, Gordon, because Lonnie Henley said no credible China expert believes that China is really a threat. He's the head of the China desk, the Asia desk at the DIA. General Flynn, Lieutenant General Flynn, brought me in to debate him. I said, why do you want a money manager from Dallas to come in and talk to this guy? He brought in Michael Swain, who is Carnegie Institute for World Peace, who is a very soft on China, and the former investment banker, the World Bank #2, was a Chinese citizen. They came in, and I'm debating, and our moderator is a man reprimanded by the DIA because he went into court and defended his mentor, a man named Manaparto, who was convicted of spying for China. And these are the people in the government that are telling our government China's not a problem. They have infiltrated our government. So he said, no credible China expert. I said, how about Gordon Chang? He said, oh, well, Gordon. How about Mike Pillsbury? Oh, well, Mike. How about Andy Marshall, who was the head of the Office of Net Assessment? Oh, he dismissed every one of them, but I'm telling you, they were wrong.
Thank you, Kevin. And as I said, Andrew, I appreciate what you're doing in the technology space to actually build systems that are protected against this kind of phenomenon, both in the computational sense and the energy space. But one of the questions that we've had, which I'm sure all of you have been hearing something about, is that there are actually health risks associated with 5G. And I gather you're a little skeptical about that, but talk us through the science here.
Sure.
Do we understand it?
Yes, right. So this comes back to this whole, I said that 5G is kind of about spectrum management, and then it's about data and compute, and then it's about cost, basically. So very, very quickly, because I don't know kind of who studied what at school, but you got a couple of things in physics to do with, so you got wavelength, which is the length of a wave, oddly enough. And then you've got frequency, which is like kind of how much of this up and down there is in a given instant of time. Basic rule of thumb is the lower the frequency, the longer the wavelength, right? The longer the wavelength, the further it can travel but the less information it can carry, the less data it can carry, right? So that's why submarine communications, they'll go all the way around the world. Whales, for example, very, very long wavelengths, low tones. So they'll go a long way, but they can't carry much data. So that part of the spectrum's no good if you want to push a huge amount of data around an enormous country like the US, for example. So now you're thinking, well, maybe it's the upper end of the spectrum. Well, the upper part of the spectrum's fantastic for carrying a lot of data, but it won't go a long way, and you have to put a ton of power into it, to carry that data. So that's why if you drive around town, you've got your country station, your rock station on FM, and it's really clear. You go out of town, they'll just disappear. That's because they can't push it very far. And then you're stuck with the kind of AM stuff, which is that sort of banda music, which probably plays on the moon, because it's the only, when you get out into the desert, it's the only stuff you can ever hear. Or talk radio, right? Because there's no information in any of those guys. So you can push that. You can push the NPR. You can push that on a.
Go easy on the talk radio bit here.
Okay, sorry. Present company excluded. So I won't get invited back. But anyway, so just sort of that's a kind of a quick bit about spectrum. So the ideal ground, right, would be in the middle, where you had the ability to push a lot of data, a lot of carrying capacity for a reasonable distance, especially if you're trying to cover an enormous country, right? The issue is that in this country, the DoD owns that part of the spectrum. That's the part of the spectrum that's essentially going to be used for 5G everywhere else. So one part of the solution here that someone says is, okay, well, why don't we do something further up the top end and just have more base stations? Well, the networks aren't crazy about that because that puts the infrastructure cost way up. So you have to have more repeaters and more data and compute, which is more cost. So then the fear is, well, what they're going to do is they're going to take that situation and just crank up the power to push more data in that part of the spectrum, and that's when everyone starts worrying they're going to get microwaved. That's not going to happen. Absolutely no way. I mean, you're talking about a country here which takes forever to approve a drug, where you have to put reflective strips around the corner of your steps. There's just no way. There's no way that's going to happen here. But it's the kind of thing that's put out there it's some sort of scaremongering, but not going to happen. It's going to end up in this part of the spectrum called the sub-6 that the DoD is currently managing, and that will get worked out, and that is absolutely safe. And because of the technology we've now developed, which runs on a quarter of the energy, has 100 times the compute power, is EMP resilient, and is very, very cost effective, there's no incentive to go blasting everyone with waves in order to push this amount of data across a country this size. So we've tackled that problem. It's just it hasn't made it out into the mainstream fear media complex yet. And so you get a lot of these misperceptions about things, and everybody on the internet's an expert, and people put a YouTube sort of thing out there without any scientific basis. So it's hardly surprising people are confused.
And if you could stitch into it the answer to another question, which is, were the Chinese determined to dominate the world way back when Richard Nixon opened relations with them and began the process of enriching them in ways that we've talked about enabling them? Or is this something that they've just tumbled onto with, say, Xi Jinping coming to power in recent years?
Yeah. Mao Zedong, who founded the People's Republic, had the notion that communists would take over the world. And indeed, he saw the United States as the enemy. And he actually talked about People's War. This has not gone away in Communist Party ideology. And indeed, through 5 general secretaries or 5 leaders of the Communist Party, this has continued. Xi Jinping is different in the sense that he's been much more open about China's ambitions. And he's been much more willing to assert Chinese power, and he's been much more willing to oppose the United States. So this is consistent. This is stuff that we have known. We Americans are very good at ignoring what hardline states say about us because we don't believe propaganda is important. We're a legitimate government, so we don't engage in this. But Communist China, and indeed all hardline states, North Korea, you see this again, they say certain things, it's important for them. And we have, at this point, now started to understand this. And so the question is whether China will be able to sustain itself. This is going to be a close-run thing. But one of the important things is the United States, through various times, has saved Chinese communism. We did it in 1972 at the end of the Cultural Revolution, which was a decade-long civil war. We did it again in 1989 in the immediate wake of the Tiananmen massacre, and a third time in 1999 with the agreement with China that paved its entry into the World Trade Organization, the global trading body. Now we've got a president, and thank God for this, we have a president who is not going to save Chinese communism again. And I think so we as a society, Frank, are mobilizing. It's a scene across the political spectrum. Indeed, you have, for instance, Chuck Schumer, the Democratic senator from New York, urging the president to hang tough on trade. This is a good development because we Americans, whatever stripe we are, now have a common enemy that has come out into the open. As the Chinese say, the fox has shown its tail. And right now, we understand that this challenge, for many reasons that people have been talking about here, is existential. So when we face this existential challenge, I don't think Chinese communism will be able to survive it, but we've got to be a united people, and we've got to understand what confronts us.
So China can collapse, but we've got to stop preventing it from happening.
We have got to help the process along. And Frank, it's not so much that we have to have a policy that says we want to collapse the Chinese regime, but what we do to defend ourselves against that regime by protecting our intellectual property, by protecting our businesses and workers, will have the inevitable effect, I think, of ending communism in China.
Praise God. Okay, Kevin, that subject near and dear to my heart and yours, I think, is the subject of the last question. By the way, again, these were terrific questions, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to every single one of them, but I think we've got most of them under our belts. The question is, in addition to the existential threat that we face from communist China, for those of you who've been here before, you'll know that I feel rather strongly that we're facing an existential threat from what I call Sharia supremacism as well, which is to say the jihadi doctrine that they're seeking to impose on all of us. How do those two threat vectors, those two ideological forces, present themselves, as you see it, as common enemies of ours, and perhaps to some extent, despite what the Chinese are doing to the Uyghurs, for example, as people who have a certain modus vivendi to collaborate with each other?
Like Stalin and Hitler. That's the answer. They see us as a common enemy. They work together. There's economic advantages to working together. You know, you heard the Heritage Foundation, the statement from the Georgetown professor. We own half this town, the Saudis own the other half. The reality is the radical Sharia supremacists. Now, granted, Saudi Arabia, they may want to see a prosperous economy and so forth because the people at the top want to live. But if they're a radical Sharia supremacist, they want to see the destruction of the United States. And the Chinese want to see a domination of the United States. And they'll work together to destroy us, and then they'll turn on each other. And I think that's Stalin and Hitler.
Well, my own view is we should help them do that. We are at the end of our time. The museum is going to close shortly. I want to say thank you to this extraordinary group, and also to you. If you're interested in not only what they've said and going back and taking it aboard a little bit more at your leisure, as well as the now dozens of similar kinds of presentations that we've been able to present over the past 3 months, please go to presentdangerchina.org.